Thanks, Andy. Well, thanks, everyone. Actually, the origin of Pugwash is something I cover in the book because, I don't know if you know, but it arose from a manifesto that was issued by Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein back in 1955, when the threats from the radioactive fallout from large-scale nuclear weapons testing was first beginning to be understood. And a notable signatory of that manifesto was Joseph Rotblat, who was famously the only scientist to leave the Manhattan Project on grounds of conscience once he realized that the Germans were not going to be able to make a bomb and that the US bomb was likely to be used on civilians. And this was significant because in 1939, Rotblat had been one of the first physicists to realize that the fissioning of uranium-235 would release neutrons that would cause other fissions in a chain reaction, and that this would happen within less than a microsecond, and therefore this process would be able to cause an explosion. And Rotblat went to study this phenomenon in Liverpool in 1939, but he was forced to leave his wife behind him in Poland, and she was then trapped there by the outbreak of war, and later was murdered by the Nazis in the Holocaust in Belzec death camp. Rotblat was later president of Pugwash conferences, and along with them, he received the Nobel Prize in 1995 for his untiring campaigning against nuclear weapons. So thanks again to British Pugwash for supporting this event today. It's a history that I'm very proud to be associated with. Also, before I start, I don't know what Hay Festival policy is with difficult material, but there's kind of a trigger warning attached to this presentation I'm about to give. I'm going to talk about some pretty horrific things involving mass death by burning and starvation, cannibalism, violence, and abuse of all sorts. So if you think you're going to find this difficult to hear, please stay, because that's the whole point. Similarly, for any young children, please do remain in your seats and find out the terrible details of what the grown-ups planned for your future when they invented and deployed thousands of thermonuclear weapons on hair trigger alert right across the globe. Speaking for myself, I grew up in the late 1970s and early 1980s in the shadow of the Cold War nuclear arms race. And like many of you may remember, my friends and I expected to die at pretty much any moment with little warning. We all watched Threads, which was recently repeated on BBC Two, so I think you can still find it on iPlayer, and it scared the living hell out of us. And what's weird about today is that we're still at the same imminent risk of nuclear destruction, but nobody seems to worry about it anymore. So my contention with this book is that the biggest mistake that we can make is to stop being scared. I actually want to scare you, because the only way not to be scared is to remain either in denial or in ignorance. Okay, trigger warning over. Now let me start this lecture proper with some good news. A large-scale nuclear war, perhaps involving the exchange of a significant fraction of the 12,000 warheads we have today in the arsenals of the nuclear powers, would definitely not kill all life on Earth. Many plant species would survive, especially those that can regenerate from rhizomes in the soil and seeds that are resistant to burning and intense cold. Small mammals that can hibernate or live underground for extended periods would probably also make it through, alongside dormant reptiles and things like that. And of course, bacteria and fungi will be fine, and even do quite well for a few years, especially those that feed off dead humans. It's going to get even more fun, don't worry. If previous mass extinctions are anything to go by, my guess is that perhaps as much as half of current global biodiversity would scrape through and begin to repopulate and regreen the Earth in the centuries and millennia after a nuclear war. Within a few million years, biodiversity might even have evolved back to current day levels. As I say, we know this from previous mass extinctions in geological history, which is a topic I'm fascinated by. And the most interesting of all is the asteroid that hit at the end of the Cretaceous, and it's notable really because of the climate change impact that it had, and that's probably in fact the closest historical analog that we have to a full-scale nuclear winter here on Earth. So when this huge space rock hit 66 million years ago in a shallow sea in a place which today is centered on the small village of Chicxulub in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, it basically incinerated the entire surface biosphere. The initial fireball was bad enough, but then there was all the ejected debris which fell back through the atmosphere and which generated infrared radiation equivalent to 1 megaton hydrogen bombs exploding at a rough spacing of every 6 kilometers around the entire planet. So for the surface, it was like an oven set to broil, which is like a temperature of about 260 degrees Celsius. And it's weird that we think of dinosaurs as a bit thick because they died out in this extraterrestrial cataclysm. But don't forget, dinosaurs had already survived for 160 million years by this point. Anatomically, modern humans, on the other hand, have been around for less than 500,000. We're very smart, of course, so we've got NASA out there with its asteroid monitoring and deflection program. And, you know, we're not going to be caught off guard by an asteroid impact like those dumb dinosaurs. But wait, we've also built machines that can precisely target and incinerate our own cities with thermonuclear explosions, whereas an asteroid, you know, might hit the ocean or might hit the poles or not do too much damage. We're going to end our own civilization at the press of a few buttons, maybe even using AI, and how clever is that? So I think that's a fitting way for humans to go. Our own intelligence can destroy us, and that's a theme I'll come back to later. Anyway, back in the Cretaceous, everything burned, and this worldwide firestorm put about 15,000 teragrams of soot in the atmosphere, which is about 100 times what we could do by burning all our cities in a nuclear war. Teragrams are million tons, by the way. Having said that, once it's dark, and so these 2 orders of magnitude difference actually aren't all that important. It's basically pitch black, certainly for several months at least. So photosynthesis stops everywhere, the oceans begin to freeze over, and our best climate models, which are the same ones that we use to forecast modern-day global warming impacts, now give precise outputs for the duration and magnitude of a nuclear winter in the same way that they've reconstructed this impact winter at the end of the Cretaceous 66 million years ago. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that Trump, Putin, Kim Jong-un all just lose it and press the button. Xi Jinping gets in for good measure. It doesn't matter who starts it, it doesn't matter who retaliates, it just escalates. And no one's going to remember all these details anyway because everyone's going to be dead. But we have let's say we have an exchange of a few thousand nukes, right? And we destroy the large cities of the Northern Hemisphere. You might be surprised to hear that only about 700 million people would die outright from burning and from blast injuries. So actually the vast majority of the world's population initially will survive a nuclear war, and that's precisely why the aftermath is so horrifying. Our parents were right when they said they'd rather be under the first bomb, as you'll find out in a minute. So all these city firestorms, which are very like the ones that destroyed Hiroshima and Hamburg in the Second World War, produce about 150 teragrams of soot, which quickly rises via these massive pyrocumulonimbus thunderclouds right into the stratosphere, which is far above the layer of the atmosphere which generates ordinary weather. The sun fades away, and you've got total darkness for several months, except maybe for a midday twilight in the higher latitudes of the southern hemisphere. And it gets cold, really cold. Within weeks, everything starts to freeze, even right down to the tropics. And then there's the survivors, a mass of humanity, the billions who were unlucky enough to survive the initial firestorms, and the combatant nations and their neighbors. Those who got big radiation doses, they're dying already. You can easily tell them because their hair's falling out and they're suffering vomiting and diarrhea as their gut lining shears off. If you're interested in the geographical dimensions of radioactive fallout, by the way, which I actually am, I highly recommend a website called NukeMap, which is produced by the nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein. And it's great fun to play with because on NukeMap, you can generate casualty lists from your very own online nuclear explosions. I set one off in Cardiff. I thought that would be relevant to this audience. Just 1 megaton ground burst, nothing too huge. But it puts us in the acute radiation zone here in Hay, assuming a southwest wind, which is pretty much what we've got at the moment, for several days. So if you went outside, you'd get a lethal radiation dose in about 20 minutes. If you stayed inside, you get a lethal dose in about an hour. If you had a fallout shelter protected by 2 meters of earth, you'd survive. But the problem is, like I said, you wouldn't want to because of what comes next. So what happens is that once all the radiation casualties are dead, everyone else then begins to starve. And once we've eaten all the stored food and the livestock, well, there's only one source of living flesh available. Read Cormac McCarthy's novel The Road for an entirely plausible, if fictional, depiction of this. And it isn't just fiction. Cannibalism has actually been pretty common in earlier famines, not to mention shipwrecks and aeroplane crashes and such like. And none of these, of course, have been global. And the problem is that this nuclear famine goes on for a really long time. And that's why storing a few tins of beans and packets of pasta isn't going to work to save you. The biosphere is functionally dead. It's totally dark for several months and below freezing for several years. It stops raining or snowing. The models actually show, these are the same computer climate models, that by year 2, the globe's surface is still receiving only half of pre-war levels of sunlight. Even by year 10, it's still 4 degrees colder globally. Now that's a much deeper freeze, by the way, than during the last ice age, for at least half a decade. There's a 0-degree isotherm, which is the line of same temperature, in the models that shows a projection for the line where the average temperature during the year remains below freezing. And it crosses the British Isles, and it cuts India and China in half and includes most of the United States. So continental interiors are so cold that they're basically like Antarctica in the winter. It's too cold even to snow. In Iowa, in the heart of the US Corn Belt, daily minimum temperatures rise above freezing only once in 730 days, according to these models. So you have no possibility of growing crops anywhere, at least in the northern hemisphere where most people are, because the landmass becomes a polar desert. Now, all this comes from a scientific paper that was published by Lily Shea, Alan Robach, Brian Toon, and other colleagues in 2022 in the journal Nature Food, which more than anything convinced me to write this book. And it wasn't just the text of the paper, but a table they included, which I found most shocking, because it showed the projected percentage of the current population in each country that would suffer starvation in this post-nuclear hellhole. And I reproduced it in simplified form in my book, so you can look up your own country, depending where you come from, and see your projected fate. I'll give you a few examples. So this is the column showing the proportion of population eliminated by year 2 after a nuclear war and the subsequent nuclear famine. So Bangladesh, 97% died. China, 99% die. Iran, 98%. Israel, 96%. Japan, 98%. North Korea, 100% die. South Korea, 99%. Kenya, 87%. Uganda, 98%. Belgium, 100%. Germany, 99%. Russia, 98%. Ukraine, 99%. United Kingdom, 99%. Canada, 99%. United States, 99%. And it goes on. So you're probably thinking, and this is the question I most frequently get asked, where should you go to get the best chance for survival? And there's some outliers. We've got Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, all have 0% of their populations eliminated in this model. And they're in the southern hemisphere, they've got lots of land, and although their neighbors still do have tens of millions of starving people, so it's not all good news. Australia has 0% also in terms of projected death rate, but that's probably just a glitch in the model. New Zealand has 68% starvation rate, so don't go there either. But anyway, I think you get the picture. And at a global level, if you tot all this up, about 5.3 billion people starve in the nuclear famine. But in the paper, that's for a 2010 population, so I rounded these up proportionally to a current global population of 8 billion. And I came up with a death toll of about 6.6 billion people within 18 months from a nuclear war. And that includes, as I say, almost certainly everyone in this room and in this country. And, I'll let that sink in for a second. So civilization is over. Viewed from space, the Earth has been switched off like a celestial light bulb. From blue, green, and white, it's gone to dirty brown. That's the mass extinction layer for non-existent future geologists to sift through when they excavate the end of the Anthropocene. Plenty of soot, melted plastics, rusty iron, broken cement, some long-lived radioactive isotopes, charred wood, and lots of smashed and pulverized bone from a bipedal great ape known rather ironically as Homo sapiens. But at least we may have answered the Fermi paradox, which asks why there are no alien civilizations in the entire visible universe when we know there's trillions of exoplanets in habitable zones orbiting around other stars. We'll have shown that, at least in our case, it's because whenever a life form evolves sufficient technological power to communicate with the cosmos, it also very quickly destroys itself. Perhaps it's even a deterministic law of the universe as unyielding as quantum physics or general relativity, that no civilization can survive the technological mastery needed for interstellar communication while also surviving long term. If so, we just need to write out all the equations and fire them off into space before we all die. Now, you could argue that we might be lucky, and people often do. After all, we've survived since World War II with no nuclear weapons used in wartime. And goodness knows we've had a lot of luck in this atomic age. For example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were extremely lucky that Vasily Arkhipov was on board the Soviet submarine back on Black Saturday in 27th of October 1962. I don't know if you know the story, but basically this sub was about to dive and fire a nuclear torpedo, which the US Navy didn't know it had, on board. And the US Navy had been dropping depth charges and harassing this sub to make it surface. And the Russian captain was just about to close all the hatches and dive down and to fire this torpedo at the US Navy, which would have started nuclear war over Cuba. But then the Russian signaller got stuck in the conning tower with his searchlight just as he was about to go down below. And during this delay, Vasily Arkhipov, who was the senior officer on board, saw that one of the American Navy ships was signaling an apology, and he overruled the captain, and the nuclear torpedo was never fired. So that was a pretty lucky day. And we were also lucky, I guess, in 1980, when a Titan II missile at a silo in Arkansas exploded after an engineer dropped a wrench which pierced its fuel tank. And when the silo blew up a few hours later, one of the onlookers saw this little sparkly thing fly up into the air and then fall back onto the ground. And this was the 9-megaton W-53 thermonuclear warhead that was found a bit dented but otherwise unscathed in the ditch the next day. And that was pretty lucky. There was also the famous, I don't know if you know the story, but this famous 3 a.m. phone call in 1979 when that US National Security Advisor, whose name I won't even try to pronounce. Anyway, he got a phone call from the Pentagon saying that their system was showing 220 incoming missiles on the way. And within a few minutes, the Pentagon called back and said, no, actually, it's 2,200 incoming missiles. You better wake President Carter. And the advisor decided to leave his own wife in bed, let her just sleep through, might as well just sleep into the apocalypse. And he was just about to call President Carter when the Pentagon called back and said, actually, sorry, this was a false alarm because someone actually put a simulation disk mistakenly into the bomber command warning display. So that was pretty lucky. But let's be honest, we can't expect to be lucky forever simply due to mathematical probabilities. And the probability of a nuclear war in any year, of course, it's impossible to calculate, but it probably goes up and down with geopolitical tensions. And I think most of us agree that it's pretty high at the moment. But for inadvertent nuclear war, so this is nuclear war by accident, averaged out over decades, it's been estimated at about 1% per year. Now, probability isn't additive, so you don't add 1%, 1%, 1%, but it is cumulative, as anyone who's played any game involving dice knows. And it compounds over a century to about 63%, so roughly 2/3. So even for, even 50-50 odds, we're looking at one nuclear war every 75 years or so at this level of probability. So even if you count the Second World War as a nuclear war, because there was 2 nuclear blasts, then we're due another one about now. And it's higher, actually, if you count advertent nuclear war, where some idiot actually intends to push the button. So let's be clear about the only reasonable conclusion from all of this. And that conclusion is that human beings and nuclear weapons cannot conceivably coexist together over the long term. So we have to make a choice as a species. Either we abolish nuclear weapons or they abolish us. Now, you will say, no doubt at this point, and everyone does, that it's politically impossible. And maybe that's true, but then at least you're helping to solve Fermi's paradox, because you're saying that an advanced technological civilization cannot survive long term. And I get that. The laws of physics are universal. So splitting the atoms of heavy elements in fission will be fairly easy to discover anywhere in the universe. And so will thermonuclear fusion of light elements like hydrogen and tritium, because that's what powers the stars, after all. Maybe we are just doomed to die, even though we can see it coming, and just as inexorably as that asteroid that loomed ever brighter in the sky at the end of the Cretaceous. Perhaps we're simply saying, don't look up. However, I remember this very kind of pessimism verging on denialism from the early stages of a different issue that I've already written far too many books about and been involved in campaigning on now for a quarter of a century, and that's climate change. Believe me, when I started writing my first book in 2000, that was called High Tide, and I was able to present it here in Hay in 2005. But back then, it was impossible to imagine a future where we didn't get catastrophic global warming. Solar and wind, so renewable energies were impossibly expensive. The electric cars were basically milk floats. Oil and coal use was increasing all the time. And the idea of fully decarbonizing industrial society seemed like a naive fantasy shared only by hippies living in mid-Wales. Well, it's been a lot of COPs since then, lots of social movements, lots of technological innovations, and now we're looking at a future where even the International Energy Agency calls the transition to the end of the fossil fuel age unstoppable. And of course, Trump will do his best, but on this issue, I think he will fail. So, and actually, nuclear weapons should be a much simpler problem to solve. We don't need them in any way like we needed fossil fuels, which were and still are the basis of all modern life. We might need nuclear power, but we sure as hell don't need thermonuclear weapons, and we can easily distinguish between the two and keep them separate indefinitely without having to fundamentally uninvent any knowledge. But we've got to pretty much start from scratch in terms of tackling this issue. Pugwash and Global Zero and various other groups have been working on this heroically for decades and fully deserve the Nobel Prize. But everything they achieved, from test ban treaties to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, are now heading for the scrap heap. Indeed, virtually all the old arms control treaties have now collapsed. The final one, the so-called New START Treaty, will actually expire next February. Meanwhile, China's aiming for nuclear parity with the US and with Russia. And they've currently got about 500 warheads right now, and they're aiming for 1,000 by 2030. And given how quickly stuff gets built in China, I imagine they'll achieve that target. Iran's probably going to get a bomb within months or weeks if the US attacks their nuclear sites unsuccessfully. Russia showed clearly in Ukraine that nuclear weapons can actually help with wars of aggressive conquest, even if you don't use them, because their deterrent effect reduces pushback from the rest of the world. So actually, the lesson from this, and many of you might know this story, is that Ukraine was very foolish to sign the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where it gave up its legacy Soviet nuclear weapons in return for a guarantee of security from the very neighbor that a couple of decades later invaded it, meaning Russia, of course. North Korea's horrible regime is pretty much untouchable now that they've got plutonium and also probably hydrogen bombs. And with the US nuclear umbrella removed, Kim Jong-un might actually end up winning, finally, the Korean War. And Taiwan seems doomed unless it can quickly get nukes itself, perhaps. So you can see where all of this is going. And all of this, paradoxically, is why, to my mind, global zero is the only option. Because if any country has a nuclear weapon, then you need a nuclear weapon too for deterrence. Therefore, everyone gets nuclear weapons. And if you have more, you've got a power advantage, then you've got an arms race, and sooner or later, the human race destroys itself. So none of this is actually in anyone's interest, ultimately. But the only way out of this collective action dilemma is for nobody to have a nuclear weapon to start with, not one. So this isn't net zero, this is actual zero. And there's only 9 nuclear weapon states. I call them the nuclear 9. I sometimes play a game at dinner parties, getting people to name them, because it's surprising how few people can. And yes, I make a scintillating dinner guest, so I can bring a nuclear chill to any dinner party. So if you need reminding, they are, I'll give you 3 to start with, and you can shout out the rest. United States, Russia, China, Israel, Pakistan, yes, France, India, UK, China, we said. So I think, oh, and did anyone say the UK? Yeah, we shouldn't forget ourselves, should we? But actually, I guess it's a bit more complicated than that, because a lot of other countries shelter under the US nuclear umbrella. But that's only needed for deterrence and to prevent proliferation. So the problem is now that with the US gone rogue under Trump and with NATO broken, the whole system is beginning to fall into disarray. But remember, even in a zero-sum competitive game, collective suicide isn't in anyone's interest. Now, we can't stop wars. I don't think global peace is a realistic prospect, but we can stop a war that destroys the biosphere effectively forever. And Gorbachev and Reagan realized this perfectly well when they met in 1985, I think it was in Reykjavik, and issued a statement saying that nuclear war cannot be won and therefore should never be fought. Logically, if you can't fight the war, then you don't need the weapons. So the only way to fulfill that is, as I say, to get to total abolition. And if this seems impossible, remember just how perilous the current moment is. I called my book 6 Minutes to Winter because 6 minutes is the estimated time that the US president has to decide whether to order a retaliation once incoming missiles are detected. In his memoirs, Ronald Reagan lamented that, and I'm quoting here, 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on a radar scope and decide whether to unleash Armageddon. How was the accent? Thank you. And the writer, Annie Jacobson, she's also American, but I won't attempt the accent, but she wrote a book in actually just this year called Nuclear War: A Scenario, which I highly recommend. And she says 6 minutes is roughly the time it takes to brew a 10-cup pot of coffee. More picturesquely, George W. Bush, W, complained that 6 minutes wasn't even enough time to get off the crapper. Personally, I think I could probably get out of the toilet in less than 6 minutes if I knew a nuclear war was coming, but I take his point. Now, this fearsome US posture is called launch on warning, and the logic is that it's needed to maintain deterrence because the only way that an enemy won't be able to destroy your weapons on the ground in a full counter-force attack and thereby gain an advantage is to get your weapons into the air, so out of the silos, into the air before any of the incoming missiles hit. And that means you need to launch hundreds of ICBMs when the incoming missiles, as Reagan said, are just blips on a radar screen. And of course, this raises the prospect of and the risk of an awful mistake. And also the US nuclear doctrine is that the president has sole launch authority. So no one else has the power to stop or even question a launch order anywhere in the military or even the civilian chain of command. So at the current time, President Trump can literally make the order on his own. And all that happens is that the orders get relayed and the missile silo operators open their envelopes and turn their keys simultaneously, up go the ICBMs, and you unleash Armageddon. And we can assume that Putin has a similar sole authority and Xi Jinping likewise, given that they're real dictators already, while Trump's still only a wannabe. And the way that ICBMs work is that once they've taken off, there's no way of either recalling them or changing their targets. They've got a ballistic trajectory, which means that their direction is preset. And once launched, they travel up into space and then back down under gravity in a big arc. There's no self-destruct button on an ICBM in case an enemy could hack it and destroy your counterattack. Hence 6 minutes to winter, because there's only a 6-minute decision window, and bang, you've got a nuclear winter. So I start the book with a scenario of my own, which shows how, under conditions of presumed attack, it would be virtually impossible for the US president not to order a launch. The pressure would, I think, simply be too much. And that's why Kennedy was fully prepared to risk nuclear war in 1962, because in human calculations, war is always better than backing down and looking weak. The entire history of our species, if you don't believe me, shows that humans will gladly die for glory and for defense. There's no reason, I don't think, why modern humans in the 21st century will be any different. We always make the ultimate sacrifice given sufficient peer pressure and enough stirring rhetoric. And any nuclear war is unlikely to be a limited affair. If you destroy New York or Shanghai, do you really think there'll be no retaliation? You have to punish an aggressor. Our whole moral code depends on it. So if you wipe out 2 cities and the capital for good measure, then they're going to respond with their full force, and the whole process will probably play out in less than an hour, which is far too quickly for anyone to really understand what's even going on. So I'll read out a bit of the passage that's in my prologue here, where I tried to bring this to life. So the beginning of the scenario is that there's a missile's just hit New York on a weekday morning with no warning. No one knows who's fired it. There's a signal that dozens more missiles are incoming, but it could be a software malfunction. So here's my quote. The president asked for advice, and the Joint Chiefs disagree with each other. The fog of war is already obscuring deliberations in the bunker. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, representing the US Army, advises an immediate full-scale launch to get nuclear assets away before they're destroyed on the ground by the presumed incoming missile salvo. "We're sitting ducks," he shouts. "They've hit us once. What are we waiting for?" The vice chairman, representing the Navy, disagrees, but he has less to protect, as his missile-bearing submarines are somewhere out to sea and thus invulnerable to any incoming warheads. However, the Secretary of Defense points out that this may not matter much if command and control ceases to exist, because any launch order from the Navy's nuclear subs will never arrive once Washington has been wiped off the map. The president cannot believe that no one's thought of this before. The Joint Chiefs, talking over each other now due to lack of time, remind the president that these issues were covered in the standard nuclear briefing conducted immediately after his inauguration 18 months earlier, and that, in fact, hardened military facilities do exist that can get submarine-launched ballistic missiles away, but they still need presidential authorization. There's no time to resolve the debate, given that 2 minutes remain now until incoming missiles arrive, if the early warning system is correct, that is. The White House bunker already seems uncomfortably hot, as if too many people have squeezed into the room. Everyone is sweating, though most feel horribly cold. Fingers shake and toes tap under the table. "The vice president's on his way," someone shouts. The president asks for quiet and motions for the nuclear football to be opened. "Has a decision been made?" asked the Joint Chiefs, suddenly united over in the Pentagon War Room. The president demurs, placing his hands over his face. Beads of sweat are running down his forehead. He murmurs something, but it's not audible. Valuable seconds tick by. Breaking with military protocol and constitutional doctrine, the Secretary of Defense suggests a vote of those present to share the moral burden. The president shakes his head. Lots of voices are raised, and order in the room begins to break down. This is the Defense Secretary's moment to assert control. "Mr. President," she shouts over the rising clamor, "if we do not respond, it is tantamount to surrender. The US must never surrender to aggression. We must fight back while we still can, or there will be no world left worth saving once after democracy is snuffed out." The president responds at last. This is not President Trump, by the way. "I cannot order the deaths of 200 million people alone, or I will be rightly condemned as the worst criminal in history, worse than Hitler, than Stalin, or Genghis Khan." He begs, "Who am I even supposed to kill when I don't know who launched the missile?" The defense secretary reminds him that the incoming salvo can only have come from Russia or China, and so retaliation must target them both. She tells him that he will not be alone. All those present will issue the order jointly, and moreover, it would be criminal not to do so, because then only millions of Americans would die, and die in vain while dictators triumph. This would be worse than losing World War II, she concludes. "Remember your oath of office," says an admiral, unbidden somewhere off to the side. You're sworn to protect the Constitution and our republic. Heads nod. No one disagrees. Everyone has doubts, but no one voices them. No one wants to be the voice of weakness, of surrender, of caution. And so, by tacit consensus, a decision is made. An intern rushes sobbing from the room. No one turns their head. Thus, the deaths of 1,000 million will now avenge the death of 1 million. The aide-de-camp who follows the president, always carrying the nuclear football, speaks for the first time. With the calm hands of a well-trained soldier, he enters the targeting options on the president's behalf, and he wants to make it clear that the order can only be stopped if rescinded within 30 seconds. The Pentagon responds over the line. Is the launch order confirmed? With shaking hands, the president consults the nuclear biscuit, a little plastic card kept in the inside pocket of his suit, reading out the letters to a hushed room. Is this final? Asks the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The president nods, barely perceptibly, and on this gentle, solemn nod, the future of the biosphere and human civilization turns. So you notice in this scenario, as I said, the US has a decent president who's on the side of democracy, so except it's all a bit over-optimistic. But I hope you get the point, because something similar would probably happen actually in Moscow and Beijing. And sooner or later, it will happen unless we get rid of nuclear weapons entirely. It's a completely binary choice, actually. Either we get rid of the weapons, either the weapons survive or we do. And actually, it's already the official policy of the United Nations to have nuclear abolition. How many people in this room have heard of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Hands up? So not a huge number. Well, the TPNW was actually fully adopted in 2017 and entered into force in 2021, has 93 state signatories and 70 full state parties. So that's basically half the world is signed up to this agenda. And in its Article 1, each state party undertakes never to develop, test, produce, possess, transfer, use, or threaten to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. So you'll notice there's no exclusions to this clause because, as Gorbachev and Reagan said back in 1985, can be no winners in a nuclear war, so one should never be fought. Now, I agree this seems impossible with current geopolitical realities, but then there's no political pressure to do it. There's no global movement demanding abolition of the sort that forced world leaders to ultimately eventually face up to climate change. And it's going to take time to build one, it's going to take decades even, but this means there's no time to waste because the clock is ticking and one day our luck will surely mathematically run out. Now, the last thing I did while researching this book was to visit Hiroshima, and the A-bomb dome was pretty amazing to see it firsthand, and you'll see it in the background in my author photo on the online Hay Festival program and also in the book. But for me, the most striking thing in Hiroshima was this small granite memorial that was there a couple of streets away, and that marks the hypocenter of the atomic blast. So if you're looking up, you'd be looking at the center of the fireball. And a few hundred meters away, there's a survivor willow tree, which was scorched and cracked in the blast. But miraculously, this tree survived, and it's still putting out green branches today. I also met a Hibakusha lady. That's one of the human survivors of the atomic bombing. She was called Teruko Yahata, and I felt incredibly privileged, actually, to have a one-on-one meeting with her at the Hiroshima Museum and have her to describe to me at first hand what that awful day on the 6th of August 1945 had been like. She was 8 years old at the time, and after their house was destroyed in the blast, she told me they were all soaked from the black rain that fell from the sky. Then they started to see people fleeing from the burning city, and she told me, and I'll quote here, "Their hair was standing on end, and their bodies were sometimes completely burned. They were covered in dust, and the skin that was peeling off their arms and dangling from their fingertips resembled old rags." She called them a river of ghosts. So I asked Teruko Yahata whether the American bombing was in any way justified to end the war, which of course is the big question that everyone always has. And this is what she said to me in English, because she'd memorized this speech, and she wanted me to take it and to pass it on to the world, including to you here today. And so this is where I'm going to end my lecture with a quote from her. She said, First of all, everyone, please try to imagine for yourself if the same thing happened in your hometown or city and an atomic bomb was dropped on your parents, brothers and sisters, children, grandchildren, teachers, and friends. People around you who are trying their very best to bring up children and to give them a bright future. What then if in a moment, in a microsecond, they were reduced to fine powder, not even a single bone left, charred black remains, male or female, indistinguishable from one another, writhing in excruciating pain, having suffered horrific burns of unimaginable degree. The after effects of radiation gradually tearing them apart from the inside out for years to come. How do you think you would feel? Nuclear weapons are capable of the complete destruction of human life and cause indiscriminate, instant death. We must work our very hardest to abolish nuclear weapons and to remove them from the earth forever, before they destroy everything we hold dear. It's no longer about the complex emotions that cause hatred or about bearing grudges, which we must somehow try to overcome. It is about the future, our future, the future of civilization, humanity, and the planet. End quote. Thank you. And well, thank you so much for listening. And if you bring up the lights now, according to the studio monitor, we have exactly 17 minutes for questions. So, is there anything I haven't covered? I'd love to. I mean, I'm also very happy for you to make comments or anything. Yeah, number 2 over there, please.
Sorry, I mean, I think the point you make that it's so horrible is exactly the reason why you need to keep them. Do you think Russia would have invaded Ukraine if they'd had their nuclear weapons?
I made that very point. I said Ukraine was foolish to sign the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 because in return for a guarantee of security from the very country that invaded them, then, roughly 10 years, was it 10, no, 20 years later.
But then that's an argument for not getting rid of them.
No, it's an argument for everyone getting rid of them. I'm not, and I should make this point clearer. I'm not arguing for unilateral disarmament on anyone's part, because that was the lesson from CND and from the 1980s, that's not a viable negotiating strategy to put, almost quoting Trump here, but to put all your cards on the table face up at the very beginning. So I think if the United Kingdom is serious about getting rid of nuclear weapons, as it has indeed agreed to be under the NPT, then our leverage with the Kim Jong-uns and the Vladimir Putins of this world is our offer to get rid of our nuclear weapons if they do, under some kind of round of trust building and but basically a disarmament process where the whole world has to disarm together, or at least all of those 9 nuclear weapon states. How about the lady here on the middle, and then if there's anyone else. Sorry, I'll let you do the choosing. But yeah.
I think we can agree. Everyone in this room would agree that nuclear weapons are awful. Based on the projections that you have done, they would end the world as we know it. But isn't it realistically like Pandora's box? Once the idea is out, you can't kill an idea, especially when an idea is fact. And that's what's happening now. Someone would keep hold of them. And the real question, I think, isn't how easily could a nuclear war happen, because we're just making projections. The question is that we know is what has prevented it happening so far. And the answer to that, surely, is the simple acronym of MAD, of what you're talking about, mutually assured destruction. We would love there to be no nuclear weapons. We would love there to be no paedophilia, but these things are not going to happen. So we need to be practical and strategic. I despise them. I just don't think they're going to go away.
Yeah, I mean, mutually assured destruction works very well until the day that it doesn't. And that day will eventually dawn. And as I say, it's you may not believe this. You may think that we can continue to be lucky forever. But one day, given how close we've come to the brink in the past, the button will be pushed or a nuclear weapon will be launched inadvertently, and that will then cause a much larger exchange, which has all of the impacts that I've laid out for you. You may not believe this is possible, and maybe you believe that the Fermi paradox will be solved in the way that I suggested. It's actually, I don't know, having a thermonuclear weapon isn't that easy to do. You have to have a delivery mechanism, so you need to have a missile. You need to have the ability to create and store and deploy highly enriched uranium or plutonium, plus the fusion fuel. So it's not that easy to do. And I think it's analogous possibly to biological and chemical weapons, which are potentially much easier to deploy. And you have to have an international regime which fully controls the nuclear fuel cycle. So, because I believe that we need nuclear power, and it's fundamentally the same technology. Each nuclear reactor generates plutonium, for example. And so taking that out of the reactor, fabricating into a bomb and all of that isn't impossible, but it is possible to control and it is possible to monitor. So I think politically this is a solvable problem. The knowledge of how to make one will not go away. I've learned about it. It's on Wikipedia to a large extent, right? So any future human and any future human civilization, assuming that knowledge continues, will be able to do this again. And as I say, any civilization in the universe can figure out quite easily how to do it. But we have to have the intelligence and we have to have the political strategies to be able to control that knowledge once it exists, as we do in other areas of potentially catastrophic technology. Where's next? Over there. Please.
Hi, thank you. This has all been developed in a world controlled by and for men. I was just wondering, you must imagine a path to zero, and whether or not that might be different if women were allowed into the room or even controlled it.
Yes, I made the Secretary of Defense a woman in my scenario there, just to annoy you in advance. But I sort of agree with your analysis. I mean, I was thinking about this the other day. There's probably only been like one. Maybe anyone could tell me wrong, but I think there's only been one female dictator who had well, maybe Indira Gandhi, but certainly Sheikh Hasina of Bangladesh, who recently fell from power, actually, probably. So it may be that there are gender differences in terms of how power is deployed and the willingness to deploy mass violence. But men aren't going to go away, and so we still have this ultimate challenge. And you notice that the peace movements of the past have been very much women-centered and women-led, from Greenham Common to some of the other groups, and I hope that'll happen again. We need this movement to be built. We need it to be built from the ground up, and we need ultimately to get to a stage where we have, a transformative political movement which can really force world leaders to come to the table and to get to the stage where we have, fundamental disarmament measures which ultimately get us to global zero. Who's next? Yeah, there.
I'm afraid I share the view of the gentleman who spoke earlier, but just on the whole thing of if it were at all possible to aim for what you're aiming. And my question to you then is, how optimistic are you that we're ever going to get there? And how long do you think it would take, since you think that the next nuclear thing is statistically ready to happen now?
Yeah, I mean, well, you have to live each day as it comes, don't you? I still pay into our mortgage, so obviously I believe that we will survive for another 20 or so years at some emotional level. But I mean, to be serious, we just have to start. I don't know where it's going to end up, but at the moment, as I said, there's no nuclear cops, or I mean, the TPNW has meetings, but there's no political pressure on them. There's no Greta Thunberg, sounding the alarm in the General Assembly and making all world leaders listen. And there's very little coverage in the world's media. And yeah, I think, and I'm sure you will feel the same way, that we're aware that this threat lingers above us, and those of us of a certain age have had that since the Cold War. And we all felt after the end of the Cold War, well, thank God for that, there's now disarmament happening. We're now free from this terrible, this terrible fear that one day the nuclear war is going to happen. But we're now into a world with the polarities. Polarities have shifted. You've got the US, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got these nuclear powers which are, I think, in a situation where we could see another war. And that's why I started writing the book in 2022, when the Ukraine crisis was really getting going. And I think a lot of people felt, oh, this actually is now back on the agenda and could really happen. And the launch on warning posture of the United States is insane. They should at least have a no first use policy, which China actually does, to its credit. But at the moment, both the US and Russia will use nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack. So this is what Putin made very clear in Ukraine, that if NATO goes too far, then there would be, how he would escalate it, I don't know, whether it's starting with a small tactical nuclear weapon or what. But the point is that nuclear weapons in that scenario are already being deployed, but only in the minds of the leaders who are faced with this terrible choice about how far to go. Did you ask whether I was optimistic? Oh, well, I didn't answer, did I? Look, if you're a campaigner, you have to be optimistic. You can't call for a campaign to start and then think, well, and then say, well, ultimately it's not going to work. No one's going to bother, you know. So I'm really just kind of throwing this out there in writing the book and seeing whether people take this up, see whether people care enough, or see whether we're ultimately going to stay in denial, because you need to be in denial to live your life knowing that this threat still exists and that we're doing nothing about it. Who's next? Over there, yes, please.
Hello, thanks very much for the talk. It's really interesting. I think it's very easy for us to, put pressure on states who are trying to develop nuclear weapons that we already don't really agree with. But what do you do about those states who we're sort of friends with and who might now be in a position where they say, give us nuclear weapons as well? So say if Poland or Estonia turned around and said, we want nuclear weapons, like how do we just say, right then, that's it, you're out of NATO? Or how do we put that pressure on?
Well, I mean, you're not wrong. They actually are having these very discussions right now. I think Finland said this, people in Poland as well, and in Sweden, largely because they no longer have the confidence in the US nuclear umbrella via NATO. I mean, Donald Trump seems to want to destroy NATO, certainly seems to want to undermine the confidence that, Article 4 would be in Article 5? Yeah, would be invoked if there was an attack on a NATO member country. And so with that logic, then yes, it's every country for itself, even within the NATO alliance. And so you would need a nuclear weapon to deter against the nuclear weapons of the Russians or whoever the aggressor party is. But this is not a problem you can solve unless you get rid of nuclear weapons. So I'm sorry to sound like an idealist. I think Max Hastings wrote a review in the Times a couple of weeks ago of the book, saying that I was a Green Party, what was it again? Green Party, you remember? Green Party simplistic or something like that. Basically saying it was a completely naive fantasy that we could ever get to a world without nuclear weapons. But then we'll destroy ourselves, fine. Literally, it's a binary choice. And Max Hastings said he defended mutually assured destruction. I called him Mad Max. I thought it was quite good. Who's next? Yeah. Oh, hello, Rosa.
Hello. I was just wondering, practically, how do you get rid of nuclear weapons? Can you just put them in a hole, or can you destroy them?
That's a great question. Even though this is my daughter, I did not prep her to ask this. No, it really is a great question, because this material needs to be taken out of. First of all, you have to take the warheads out of the missiles. Then you have to dismantle the warheads. Then you have to get rid of the material, whether it's the fusion or the fission fuel. So for plutonium and for highly enriched uranium, you can actually fabricate it into nuclear fuel. And the best thing to do is to burn it up in a reactor and use it to generate carbon-free, 24/7 carbon-free power. And by the way, there was actually a program, and this is really not prepped, but there was a program in the 1990s after the Cold War called Megatons for Megawatts. And actually, a third of US electricity was actually produced from decommissioned Soviet nuclear weapons. So that was a phenomenal thing, which almost nobody knows about. We've got 5 minutes left. So how are we doing? You're both up there. So whoever's got the mic, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for the lecture. Thank you for remaining optimistic. My question is, if you look at the powers that hold nuclear weapons, where is the political leadership amongst them to start this conversation?
Well, Keir Starmer, obviously. And I say that as a member of the Labour Party. I don't know, it's not there. It's not there anywhere, which is why I think it has to come from the grassroots. I think this has to be a citizens' movement initially, and we've got to put pressure on the leaders and the powers that be around the world to tackle this issue, because they're not going to do so unilaterally. Remember Barack Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize partly for raising the issue of the risk of nuclear weapons, but he was, I hate to say it, but he was all talk. He talked very well, but he didn't actually do anything. And actually, the US nuclear posture was just as dangerous, if not worse, after Obama than before. So that's because there was no, I'm sure he personally cared a lot, but there was no domestic political constituency putting pressure on him to actually deliver this thing that he cared about. And you can only, as a politician, do what you're empowered to do by your base and by the grassroots and by the support and the potential votes of electorates. So that's what's missing in this equation, is the involvement of ordinary people. Over there again.
Thanks for mentioning threads. I recently showed it to my two teenage sons, so I don't think I'm going to win Father of the Year award or anything, but I think it's really, really important. Do you think by talking about the sort of apocalyptic scenario of strategic nuclear weapons is perhaps missing the real risk? And that it's the threat of the new generation of tactical nuclear weapons, for example, nuclear torpedoes, hypersonic missiles, and that the threat there is really from escalation from the use of those weapons rather than the strategic ones?
Well, yes, but it's the ICBMs that cause the nuclear winter, whether they're submarine-launched or land-based. And actually, tactical nuclear weapons have been around for a long time. They used to have 1 kiloton ones that they carried in a backpack. Is that right? And if you fired one of those, then you'd get the blowback yourself. So they weren't even that smart. But yeah, what was the question again? Yeah, I mean, it's escalation that gets you beyond. You can destroy 20 or 30 cities, fine. That isn't going to give us a nuclear winter. It isn't going to change the climate, despite what would obviously be a horrific death toll. What I'm worried about is ending the biosphere, right? Or at least ending a biosphere that humans can live in this planet. So it's really about the scale of the nuclear exchange. And so, all right, even if we don't get to zero, even if we get to a world where the same 9 countries each have 10 nukes, fine. We're not going to get a nuclear winter scenario, and I could live with that. Although when you've got 10, if you get 11 or 12 or 20, then you're back to a nuclear arms race. So it's better to get to zero. That's the most, the strongest place to be. But yes, escalation will always happen because you're never going to accept an incoming, the losses from even a tactical nuke without responding in kind. Who's next? I'm sorry, the people with the paddles decide. So yes.
Yeah, can I just bring it back for a moment to the human level? I'm really interested in the fact that this argument really seems to have fallen off the political agenda. You don't hear much about it, do you, really? Mm-hmm. And I just wonder if you think that as part of the human condition is that we are just not programmed to be able to contemplate our own destruction, so we just can't imagine it. So I know I'm a doctor. When I speak to patients about having an operation, sometimes that's very risky for them. If I say to them, this operation, you might die having this operation. That is actually not a very powerful argument, rather weirdly. What does persuade them is when you talk about lesser things like, you might be a bit disabled, you might not get home again. That is what sways people. I just wonder if we should bring the argument about this down to a more imaginable level.
I don't know. I mean, tell that to the women of Greenham Common who devoted their whole lives to the peace camp, which was there trying to get the U.S. nuclear weapons removed during the 70s and the 80s. So I think people can, but we're a very social species. We take cues from other people. Other people have to be seen to show that this is an issue which is important to them. I feel a bit of an idiot talking about this, and everyone just go, "Well, that's depressing, isn't it?" And then you move on. But it did feel like that with climate change. I was equally terrible guest at dinner parties for that. But people have weird responses. Actually, my book was serialized in the Daily Mail, and there was a comment underneath that said, "What will nuclear war do to house prices?" And I just thought that was so British. Oh, and actually, we're out of time, so I'm going to go and sign copies of the book if you want to buy them in the book tent. I'll see you there. But otherwise, thank you very much indeed.